Welcome to the Value Investor TV podcast. This is the podcast that helps you grow your wealth and become financially independent. My name is Pekko and my partner Hari.
Hello.
This episode, we will talk about current events. A lot is happening right now. Obviously, we're still in the midst of global pandemic, and in the U.S., we are. I'm sitting here in California, and Hari, you're over there in Texas. The economy is kind of still not fully functioning yet. So there are lots to talk about, right? The debt level that's going on, not only in the corporate sector but also sovereign nations are racking up debts, and COVID-19, what's to come, all those things we'll talk about in this episode. All right, let's get started, Hari. Can you give us a quick disclaimer before we start?
Yeah, this is the Value Investor TV podcast. We are a podcast that helps you understand the concepts behind value investing. We aren't talking about any stocks during this episode, so if you somehow figure out to invest based on what we're talking about, well, consult with your financial advisor before doing so.
Oh, I love it. Okay, great. So we were chatting before the episode. We started recording on this episode. This is kind of hit home, to both you and me, as we are going through these companies, right? I mean, this is not a recent phenomenon. This is not a past 6 months phenomena. This is a phenomena that's been taking place over a decade, and this is now just kind of materializing on the surface from our level. All the companies that we're looking at, it's rare to find a decent balance sheet, a clean balance sheet. Every company that we look at, for example, most recently we looked at Disney, we looked at McDonald's. These are giant corporations. They're loaded with debt, to the brim. And so, now how do you think about that, Hari? What is your opinion on this matter?
Well, I mean, I think the thing is that if you are an owner of one of these businesses, right? We've talked about the hired gun CEO, types who come in there. They're getting they don't really have a large stake in the company. They're getting paid tons of money to come in, and they use essentially the very low interest rates that we've had for over a decade now, and lever up the balance sheet to use that to go and buy. In the case of Disney, they bought Fox and they've bought other assets to shore up the Disney Plus thing. And when we talked about it, it was, it was an interesting play, but it was also they felt like if they didn't do it, then it would be like Disney Plus would fail. And it's like, well, people are using Disney for a lot of different reasons, right? And so just because you have to load up the balance sheet because interest rates are low doesn't mean that it's a good idea, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the thing is that these chickens are going to come home to roost at some point, right? And you see now that, in the case of Disney, that they had to borrow more money because Disneyland, Disney World have been shut down for extended periods of time, which has never happened in the history of either of those theme parks, right? And so what ends up happening that comes to kill them is really, it's not when things are going well, because that's at a point when they can pay stuff off. It's really when things get hard that they have to go and get more money, or they have to, essentially the money that they're earning is going to now go to pay off debt instead of going into your pocket, right?
Yeah. I mean, all these companies that we looked at, I don't remember the exact number, but they're at least about more than 10% of revenue goes to interest payment, just simply interest payment. And on top of that, you got to pay the principal. So it's going to be a lot more. But, I think it's slowly, it's just like sagging them. It's like this, burden on their shoulder they have to carry. And you can't grow with that kind of load. I mean, you just can't. You're just going to be, you're going to be, weighed down by that weight. So what do you do as a company if you actually had skin in the game, right? If you actually had skin in the game as a management of one of these companies, what do you do? What is the right thing to do?
The good news is that you and I don't care, because we just don't invest in those businesses, right? We look at them and we say they're in the too hard bucket, and then we just move on, right? And I think that's super important, right? As an investor, you can't get enamored with the stock. Like I've been shamelessly plugging Disney, and then we decided to look at Disney, and we all shrieked and ran away. So, I mean, I think that,
Right.
I think the important thing about this is that, as investors, you don't have to be, you don't have to solve hard problems, right? You have to solve, right? If you can find a business that's super cheap, then why the hell do you care if Disney has 30 something billion dollars in debt, right? That's the important thing to me, is that you are finding businesses that are cheap, have good metrics, that the small, 5% of the population that is doing well, right? That's who you care about. You don't care about the other ones that are struggling, right? And so, I mean, from an academic exercise, Becco and I can talk about that, right? What we should do, but this is kind of the epidemic of the 2020s, right? I think is going to be, you're going to see, we've seen this with Sears, right? Where Sears, loaded up with debt because everything was going so well for them for so long, right? That they survived 80, 90 years on their name and their reputation, and their, they had a lot of assets that, they had bought or, grew, like Allstate and, other companies that were part of the Sears umbrella. And now that's all unraveled because, they took on a lot of liability that they couldn't eventually pay off, right?
Yeah, sure. For sure. And as like you bring up a great point, like why does it matter to me, right? As an investor, you should really look for the gems, and the gems really shouldn't have these things, these problems that we're talking about right now, for sure. Yeah, definitely. What do you think about, like you said, 2020s, we're just starting the new decade here. In the past decade, it was a sort of a recovery, if you will, the cheap money. Do you think that it'll come to an end at some point? Like, is this party going to go on? Because right now, it looks like the COVID-19 hit and the government's spending, right? I mean, basically the whole world is printing money. So interest rate is low. Everyone's getting a rescue package here and there. Everyone is just loading up even more. The bubble has, instead of decreasing the bubble, popping the bubble or decreasing the bubble, it's in fact have grown. So what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that is kind of shocking about all of this is that as this bubble has kind of exploded, over the last 12 years, right? We are seeing that the financial discipline, the control of balance sheets, all of this stuff is going to eventually lead to, what we're seeing today, right? Which is companies that are heavily loaded up at the debt that are going to then, ultimately, they're going to have to, do something to pay for it, right? And you saw in the case of Disney that they had a lot of hits in the 2015 to 2020, right? They bought some great businesses for very cheap, like the Star Wars franchise, Marvel and so on. And they were able to monetize.
You're wearing one today.
Yeah. I mean, they were able to monetize those franchises very effectively, right? But what if they hit a dry spell, right? If you look at Disney in the 80s, up until like the late 80s, from the mid 70s to the mid 80s, they had some big flops, as a company, right? And then they barely survived. They, there were some concerns that they would go under. And now you're seeing them, actually giving out shares, to pay for stuff, right? So you as an investor have no control over this, and you're seeing them literally print money like the government is printing money, but they're just doing it with their own shares, right? To buy assets, to pay down debt, and so on. And so you're being hit from all sides. Dilution, assets, your asset value is, the debt load is getting higher, and then your future earnings that you're basing your investment off of are now going to paying off this debt that you had, right? And then not to mention that a lot of these businesses are still paying dividends and still doing share buybacks when
Yikes.
They don't really have good financial discipline on the balance sheet, right? So it
Sounds like a nightmare.
it really is. And I think you're going to see some fairly big companies. The company the size of Disney cannot really go under, right? Bankruptcy is really not a possibility for them at this point. I mean, I'm sorry. Bankruptcy is a possibility, but them shutting down, going bust is not, right? And Sears is kind of like, they're on their last legs if they haven't already,
Yeah, it's like a great sag almost.
yeah. And so we're going to see that. But I think the thing that's going to be interesting is that, a company like Sears was founded in the 20s, right? It may have been even older than that at this point, and was able to survive for so long. And they were actually able to thrive for so long. But look at companies like social media things, right? These things that are less than 20 years old, they may flame out. They've hit huge peaks. Are they going to flame out? Because at some point, are people just going to say, I'm done with social media, right? And you're seeing businesses that are saying, I'm not buying ads on Facebook right now because it's I'm trying to conserve money. They're saying that they have some political reasons for doing so. But I think a lot of it is also during a pandemic, people aren't buying Coca-Cola. They're not buying Unilever products. They're not buying stuff. So they're pulling back their ad spending. Mm-hmm. So I didn't answer your question. I just kind of rambled for a while, but
well, these, episodes like these, it's good to just like riff on, various topics. But, going back to the debt problem, I just, as an investor going into this new decade, right, where you will find companies that are going to be laden with debt, just like we've seen in the past episodes with, we see that with McDonald, we saw that with Disney, we saw that with many other companies. What do you, what is, as a protection against that, I'm trying to drive towards our checklist here. As a protection against that, right? You need to be looking at the checklist and figure out, if the debt load is going to be a problem. So like that financial part of our checklist is going to be increasingly more important, I feel, in the coming years, in 2020s, because of this issue that we're talking about here. You do not want to be involved. Like I said, it's going to be a nightmare to be involved in a situation where you own a company has all these different problems. So like really doing your due diligence on the financial matters, especially around balance sheet, I think is going to be critical in the coming years. What do you think?
Well, I think that the checklist is important, and it's there for a reason, right? It's to sanity check you before you just go off and, make a bunch of purchases, right? And the idea that, I think, right, if you're asking me, how do I ensure that I'm not going to be, I buy a company that's undervalued or something like that, and then the CEO screws it up by going and doing something stupid like loading up on a ton of debt, right? And I think the answer to your question really is, well, how much of that company does the CEO own? Because the CEO is not going to do something that's going to harm his own equity position, right? If his compensation is based on equity and what he already owns and what the future of the stock price is, well, then he or she is not going to do something that is going to harm his or her own position, right? And that, I think, is the most important factor in the checklist, right? That's why we have a section on management, and that's why we pay attention to what management's going to do, because, if they're spending money on buybacks when the stock price is very expensive, right? And if they are loading up on debt and doing things, it's largely because they're not thinking like an owner of a business, and they are probably incentivized to do things that are not beneficial for every shareholder, right?
Yeah,
and
100%.
And if you look at, all of the bylaws and all of these things, it says that the board is there to represent the interests of the shareholders, right? But the board is interested in representing its own interest, right? Which is I mean,
delicious sandwich. Delicious sandwich.
yeah, they're there for the sandwiches, and they get paid $250K a year. I mean, I have a hard time believing that Jack Dorsey cares about Disney, right? When he was on the board, I mean, what does he have to do with the board, right? So, this is something that probably most of our listeners don't really remember or weren't around for when it was a thing. But there was a big push, in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s to have independent board members, right? And the idea being that if they're independent, that they're not tied to any one, faction or, so on. Well, that's dumb, right? I mean, I don't want somebody independent. I want them to be financially interested in the company. And that means that they own some percentage of the company, right? And if they do that, then they'll think like somebody who owns the business. Because if it turns out if you don't own any shares of the company, you're not going to think like an owner of the business.
Yeah, I agree with you. That brings to a point that I wanted to bring up in this episode, which is you really want to find somebody who has skin in the game, right?
Yep.
And in fact, I've been actually reading this book this weekend. It's called The Skin in the Game. It's a fantastic book. It talks about exactly this matter right here. That if you don't have the skin in the game, you should, like, for example, people who give advice for a living. You should never listen to people who give advice for a living because they do not have the skin in the game.
Yep.
What do they have to lose if you actually go and actually take his or her advice and execute on it? You think this is a good idea, so you execute on it. What if it turns out to be a total stupid idea? This guy that gave you advice has no skin in the game. So, I mean, it doesn't matter to him. So,
by the way, that doesn't apply to us, to Becco and me. You should totally listen to us because
just 100%.
We have our best interest at heart here. By the way, so yeah, listen to us. We're okay. We're the exception to the rule.
Exception to the rule. It's in the footer in that book. But anyway, it goes back to the same concept. You need to find somebody. I cannot say enough about that part of the checklist. You need to be looking for actual owners who have vested interest and long-term vision of the company, not just the next quarter or quarter after. You need to have somebody who is going to be really looking out for the company for a long term, and you want to invest alongside with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that is the only way to protect your money long term, right? Is that it is very rare to see businesses that are actually paying attention to shareholder interest, right? I don't know how else to say it other than there's lots of companies that don't have your interest at heart, and it's the funny thing I see is that people don't pay attention to this and then just say, well, there's a board and there's an audit firm and there's all of these things. And it's like, none of that, there was an auditor firm for Wirecard. There was an auditing firm for, Enron. Your success is going to be based on incentives, right? Because incentives are the most powerful force in business, right? If you follow the incentives, you will see where people are going to, fall, right? I mean, you still have to make sure that the business itself is successful. I mean, if you take the most successful guy, if you gave Jeff Bezos Sears today, he's not going to be able to turn around Sears, right? Sears is a dying business for a reason. But if you have a successful business, you also want to have a successful, you want to have that CEO properly incentivized to then also make your success continue.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly. And, just to be totally transparent to our listeners, the companies that I own, companies that you own, Hari, we thoroughly vet this, and companies that we, invest with conviction are those companies that actually have founders, founder straight up or founder-like mentality CEO who are completely incentivized to do the best thing possible because his or her net worth, 100% of it is tied to the company.
Yeah, and I think if you follow that metric, you will find typically the businesses that are the best ones are the ones that the CEO is the founder or owns a significant percentage, or it's very closely held company, and you're along for the ride essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So let's switching topics a little bit here. So we talked about COVID-19. A lot of people are feeling the pain right now of economic shutdown, and also, of course, from the health consequences of this pandemic. Just speculation for fun. When do you think this will turn around here?
Well, I think if you're, I'm also a physician, so I'm gonna speak in medical terms. But one of the things that we have seen is that pandemics kind of follow a similar pattern, right? And this is kind of a somewhat mathematical equation that is dependent on how infectious the disease is, how long the incubation is, how long the disease itself is, and so on, and how deadly it is. And what you're seeing in most places is that when they get an outbreak, it's usually 3 to 4 weeks after the outbreak that the peak hits. And then after the peak hits, it's another 3 to 4 weeks before it tapers off to a kind of a steady state. And if you look at New York, if you look at Italy, if you look at a lot of these countries that have had big outbreaks, big growth in COVID cases, and then a quick shutdown, that's where you see this. So I think the thing that's kind of crazy about what you're seeing a lot of businesses being closed in certain states, and other places that the businesses didn't close, right? I mean, California was really never all that open, right? But they still saw a big uptick in cases, starting at around the Memorial Day weekend. Same with Texas, same with Florida, same with Arizona. Florida, it seems to be continuing to grow, right? And in New York, what you saw was a huge uptick in cases. But the thing about New York was New York had a much higher death rate than any of these other places. And even in New York, so the thing that people are forgetting about this, that historically, the whole purpose of the shutting down was to slow the spread so that we wouldn't overwhelm the hospital system. And, if you continue to open the cases quickly, right? The thought was that if some of these states are opening too fast and some states are not, but what you actually saw was there were places that were always open. There were places that, and they didn't have any problems. There were places that were closed, and they're seeing spikes. So it's not really that there's a one-to-one relationship. And the thing that people are not really understanding about this is, one, masks are not really all that beneficial, right? Up until the last 2 months, I have not seen a single study that said masks did anything. But now I'm seeing studies that are small and not very well done, research studies saying that there are benefits to mask use. I don't really see it. I still wear a mask, but I don't see much benefit to it. But I don't think that's really what's going to slow this down, right? What people are failing to understand is there was actually a good paper in the journal Nature that came out 4 weeks ago now, that looked at everybody's talking about antibodies. So antibodies are are part of the immune line where your body identifies something and creates a protein. That protein goes and sticks to the infectious agent, the antigen in this case, and it attracts parts of your immune system that goes and gobbles up that thing. So antibodies are something that I've heard everybody say, well, antibodies are positive and then they kind of wane off after time. Well, that's only part of your immune system, right? And that's a part that is, making a protein is not free. Your body has to create proteins. When your body makes antibodies, it's generally after it sees something. There are cells in your body that recognize that there is this antigen again and generates antibodies. So that process is fairly well documented. I'm kind of surprised by, health experts who are saying, well, the antibodies are not lifelong or not long-term or whatever, which is true. They may not last forever, but that means that you have parts of your body, the plasma cell that generates these antibodies long-term. But then the thing that is not really paying attention to is that there is the cell-mediated immunity in your body, which is you have a T cells CD4 count, a CD4 and CD8. So in the study in Nature, they found that 70% of the population who had COVID generated CD8 cells and 100% generated CD4. And which is, is to say that essentially you're going to create an immune reaction to this. And that reaction is long-lived. But the thing that was more interesting out of this was that 40% of the population who was not exposed to COVID actually already had CD4 positive cells to COVID. And what that means is that those patients had an exposure to coronavirus of some sort in their past that created an immunity that would also provide immunity to coronavirus. So this is why you see a lot of asymptomatic cases and you see a lot of people who never got anything or they had a very, very mild infection, if at all. So
just to be clear for our audience here, coronavirus, there is multiple types of coronavirus. COVID-19 is a one type of coronavirus.
Yeah, there are actually hundreds of coronaviruses. Some have no infectious, ability on humans. But what it's I think the second most common cause of the cold. The common cold, rhinoviruses and influenza are other types of viruses that cause cold or flu-like symptoms. But so the important thing that I'm trying to get to here is that I think we are actually getting to a point where our population actually has a level of immunity that we don't really understand yet. And I think that level of immunity is much larger than everybody is even thinking. So, I've heard everybody saying, well, there's secondary spikes and there's going to be third waves and fourth waves and so on. But there is already immunity in people who've never been exposed to COVID. There are people who are exposed to COVID who, they get over it and it's just they have a head cold. That's like 85% of the population. So in places that are going to be hard hit, the benefit is that they're probably not going to see significant spikes in the future, right? And I think that there is very, the evidence is not great that shutting down the economy and shutting things down actually has much benefit to society to slow this spread, right? The real benefit is that that we know how to treat this better, we know how to manage it better. People are staying in the hospital for shorter stays than they were, when New York was hit.
Sure.
So I think this is my long-winded answer of basically that this is not going to be as significant as people are of fear. Right. And I think we're going to see that there are some countries that are basically now essentially COVID free. Sweden, I think, has, they had basically no social distancing, no anything. They had a huge spike in deaths early, but now you're seeing that there's very few new cases of coronavirus because largely their population has herd immunity. Right. And I think that states, in the United States particularly, could actually see that. Whereas places that had severe shutdowns may have continued upticks of cases.
Yeah, it's like do we rip the Band-Aid off or do we prolong the pain? Either way, the surface area under the curve is going to be about the same. Is what you're saying.
Right. And I think the thing is that the whole point of this was to prevent the overwhelming the hospital system. And New York was never overwhelmed. They had a lot of cases, It was probably very scary, for them. Texas has not been overwhelmed. Florida has not been overwhelmed. We're still in the middle of it, and they may actually get overwhelmed, but we're not there yet.
Yeah. I mean, I hear the same story here in San Francisco as well. The San Francisco General Hospital was all prepared. UCSF was just totally prepared for this tsunami of patients that were going to come, and they never came.
Yep.
And it doesn't mean that I'm not trying to diminish this at all. It's just that the expectation and reality has diverged quite a bit in terms of patient in terms of the hospital management and what that means, and also it has downstream consequences
right.
to livelihood of people. I'm not just talking about stores and mom and pop shops shutting down. I'm also talking about physicians. I'm talking about people who work in the hospital, because these elective surgeries, those are the procedures that bring in money for the hospital, and they've been all shut down.
Yeah.
And as it relates to that, what's interesting is insurance companies are making it big this quarter, because they're collecting claims as usual, not claims but premiums as usual, but no one's doing any surgeries or any big ticket items. So all that is just right to the bottom line.
Well, and I think that the important thing to understand about this is that people still need to replace their car, because their car is worn down. They still need to get their elective procedure. All of these things they don't go away, right? Because COVID happens and then they shut down things, and the economy still, there's certain things that need to be purchased, and those are kind of just backfilling, right? And what we're seeing is, the thing that a lot of people don't really realize is that the median age of death in COVID is in the 80s, the low 80s, right? So a lot of the people who are dying are very old, right? We have all heard, stories in the media of a 30-something with no health problems that dies, right? But that's not really the majority of the cases, right? And the reason that New York had such a high percentage of cases that were of deaths was, that this was running rampant in the nursing homes. So, at some point we do have to rip off the Band-Aid and say, look, young people are not really getting serious infections that are, there are a few people who are, but it's not, life-threatening kind of things for the vast majority of patients. And at some point, we're all going to have to decide that, the economy can't stay shuttered forever, right? You have people who've graduated from college now who are not able to get jobs. And these are kind of people that in 2008, when the economy tanked before, they were kind of a lost generation. It took them 5-6 years to start getting into the workforce, right? And if we keep this prolonged for too long, this is going to happen again. And then,
Sure.
I think the other thing that we haven't really mentioned, and I'll say it my piece and then let you go, is that the federal government had a big stimulus package that was putting money into people's pockets to help support the unemployment and the shutdown and all that stuff. Well, that's actually depressing employment, right? If people don't have to work because they can get paid to sit at home.
Yeah, they're actually, in fact, getting paid a lot more.
Yeah.
Like some people are getting paid double
right.
what they're used to getting paid. So why the hell would I sit at home?
Right.
Or why the hell would I, take the bus, go to work, do this job, when I could just sit home, take care of my family, and get paid $1,000 a week?
Right. And so I think that's a huge part of this, that, we're recording this in the middle of July. In about 15 days, 12 days, that stimulus will end. So a lot of people are going to come back into the workforce, and the question is, are employers going to be ready to start hiring, to start opening? If states like California are going to go back, and shut things, are they going to get stimulus packages for them, or is there going to be more of a recession, right? So in those areas. So, there's a lot of questions that I don't think we have answers to, but I think the answer is that we've got to get people back to work, right? From a psychological perspective, from a economic perspective, everything needs to start getting back to normal, sooner rather than later. I mean, obviously within reason, we have to keep people safe too. But if we don't, I mean, there are very serious long-term consequences.
Absolutely. Great. We ran a little late, a little over than we expected, but I hope this was useful for you guys. We talked about a lot of things, but we like to do these episodes here and there to just add a little bit, add just a different color to our podcast. I hope this is helpful. If you guys would like us to cover just topics outside of companies, please let us know. We'd be happy to talk about anything.
I bet you didn't think you would be hearing about CD4 positive cells in a topic in a value investing podcast, but
yeah, we could actually do a deep dive in that Nature paper.
Yeah, that's true. We can.
Okay, great, awesome. Thanks guys for joining us. I hope you guys stay safe out there, and thanks for tuning in again. And see you guys in the next episode.
Yep. Thanks.